Hello and welcome to the College of Lore private tutor sessions. Everything you wanted to know about dungeons and several things you did not. First, I would recommend that you go back into your notes and check out episode 7 of the College of Lore. Here Josh and I talk about dungeons within tabletop role-playing games. We talk about the context of dungeons and what function they play in our game. In this private session, I'll be talking about the history of dungeons, some historical dungeons, and some instances of dungeons in pop culture. And finally, we'll go over some interesting D&D adventure modules with great dungeons in them. Timestamps for each of these topics and more will be in the show notes, so you can skip there to find something you're interested in. If you're interested in this long form of tutoring session, please consider becoming a patron of the College of Lore, where we plan on making more of this type of content for our top level backers. What is a dungeon? Dungeons existed to hold prisoners within the Renaissance period, but not so much within the medieval period of history where we sometimes see this in pop culture. Scotland upheld the practice of keeping prisoners in dungeons, but most other countries, well, they didn't see a need for imprisonment such as punishment. They would either tax you or axe you. One such crime could have been theft. Take a look at this. This is a diagram of an alleged oubliette in the Paris prison of La Bastille. The word dungeon comes from the French word donjon, which means a fortified keep or safe room in a castle. The closest French word with the current English meaning of a dungeon is the word oubliette.
Say that word again. What? Oubliette?
Labyrinth, I never oubliette.
Now the word oubliette comes from the French word oublivi, or in Latin, oublivici, which means to forget, which is nearly what would happen to you if you were thrown in one of these, from the Dictionary of French Architecture from the 11th to 16th century. If we try to directly translate the suffix of the word et in oubliette, meaning place, then oubliette means the forgotten place. If you don't believe me, just think of the spell in Harry Potter that's used to erase people's memories, obliviate, which, now that I think about it, is just the English word meaning to forget or wipe from existence. So I guess we could have just skipped that long walk we just took. Anyway, an oubliette is basically a tall structure with a door on the top, wherein supplies or prisoners could be lowered or raised by a rope in various cases. History has a few famous examples that have become tourist destinations that you could visit to this day. Let's talk about some famous oubliettes. Beneath Lep Castle in Kildare, there lies a famous oubliette in the central Ireland village. During renovations to this nearly 700-year-old structure, at the time, in the 1900s, maintainers discovered an oubliette hidden behind a wall. Now where were the owners of Lep Castle throwing their prisoners? Where was this dark, horrific pit kept? Why, the oubliette was discovered behind the walls of a chapel. I think the loud church songs were a convenient distraction from the screaming wails of those trapped in the pit. Now, according to this authentic source from Wikipedia, vacations.com, not only did it take 3 cartloads to remove all the bones that they found, but the prisoners didn't starve down there, like in the previous photo. No, these guys got the rings knocked out of them like Sonic, and impaled on these spikes only 8 feet below. Have a nice trip. See you next fall. Such a horrid, backwards way of dealing with prisoners, right? Something we could never do in a civilized age, yeah? Not quite. Judging from a pocket watch found at the bottom of the oubliette, we can conclude that the death pit was still being used as early as the mid-1800s. Next up, Warwick Castle. Not all oubliettes are vertical in nature. For example, this English dungeon in Warwick Castle was horizontal. Cramped, only a few feet high, French prisoners of war were shoved into the oubliette, forced to lay on top of sharp stones. They couldn't even stand up or move. If you go there now, you'll find a tourist trap. Get it? A trap, because we're talking. Full of fake torture tools and actors that pop out to scare you. This dungeon experience isn't quite authentic, but props to them for sharing a fun experience, and one of the best kept English castles. Moving on to Nottinghamshire. Another oubliette was discovered there. The story goes that Sir Robin Hood escaped from this hole in the ground in that old sheriff. So, basically, we can conclude that an oubliette is a type of dungeon. Or was it? So every hole that we find in the ground is an oubliette? Not quite. Many scholars of architecture posit that these structures, by and large, were mainly used for storage. The ones without human remains, anyway. So if you happen upon a vertical shaft, check on the outside walls for any fingernail scratches or marks before making any judgment. After all, what's the difference between a basement and a dungeon anyways? I live in my parents' basement, and they call my room a dungeon. Please send help, I'm trapped. The address is... The classic dungeon, at least when you think of one, is an underground prison beneath, sometimes, a keep or a castle. Check out these artist representations of dungeons. So we've talked about oubliettes, now let's go into some real-life dungeons. First up is Dracula's dungeon. Dracula, the mythic vampire, is based off the real person Vlad III of Wallachia. No, not Transylvania. Also known as Vlad the Impaler. Dracula became known such from his father's name, Vlad Dracul, named for his devotion to the Order of the Dragon, a monarchical, chivalric order of nobles and kings. We all know the story of Vlad III, impaling over 20,000 people around his castle to drive off the Ottomans through fear. Why did he do this? Well, he was imprisoned in and escaped from a dungeon that was governed by those people. Recently, we found that dungeon in northern Turkey. You thought I was rambling, but hey, I brought it back to dungeons. This dungeon was composed of a huge network of tunnels where no light reached beneath Tokat Castle, a horrible place. Could it be that he picked up some of his gory torture fetishes from this time there? If it's good enough for your stuff, it's good enough for people. Spilberg Castle was the location of the most feared dungeon in the Habsburg Empire. Pop on over to the Czech Republic way back in 1277, and you'll find Joseph II's storage room. He converted it into a prison that you weren't likely to escape from. Historically, this was known as the Dungeon of Nations, in which the Habsburgs would stuff full of political prisoners. Basically, anyone who didn't agree with Joseph II's radical, enlightened absolutism or isolationist foreign policies. It was in this prison political prisoners would be chained to the walls. Maybe this is where we got the view in pop culture of prisoners being chained to the walls. Finally, one of the most beautiful dungeons that I would like to be imprisoned in, if I had to be, would be in Chilon Castle, Switzerland. Just look at this place. Wow. This castle's dungeon was so beautiful, and the people who were kept there were so poignant, that Lord Byron wrote a poem about the imprisonment of Francois Bonnivard, who was captured here as a political prisoner. His sentence was to be 5 years, but the castle was taken, and he was freed after 4 long years of being lashed to the 5th pillar within the dungeon. Let's take a brief break and we'll go over some famous D&D dungeons that have persevered through time. First up, the Tomb of Horrors. This was designed by the OG GG, that's right, Gary Gygax. It was a meat grinder. Debuted at the very first Origins Game Fair in Columbus, Ohio, a convention that now has an average of 20,000 in attendance. Wait, isn't that the same amount as the amount of people that Dracula? Never mind. Designed for his friends and people who played D&D, they claimed that they had broken the game and created an unkillable player character. Now, this dungeon was full of traps. People drove out cattle before them, through the Tomb of Horrors just to clear the traps to find that epic level gold. This was a lich den that Gary Gygax designed, and it is said that you can die before you even set foot into the Tomb of Horrors. The Tomb of Horrors has also influenced later Dungeons & Dragons products. Jason Bowman used the model, as well as Indiana Jones, as inspiration for some of the traps in the 2007 D&D supplement Dragonscape. The computer role-playing game Icewind Dale, developed by Black Island Studios, was also influenced by the module. Black Isle Studios division director Fergus Urquhart said, "We wanted something that reminded everyone of their first foray into dungeons, like the Tomb of Horrors, with traps around every corner and undead crawling out of the walls." Tomb of Horrors is a key part of the novel Ready Player One by Ernest Cline, which is set in the virtual reality world created by a man who was a fan of the module. The character James Halliday recreated the dungeon in detail, which the novel's other characters must traverse to advance in the global contest and win Halliday's fortune. In the Ready Player One film adaptation, the graffiti on the back of Ake's truck is from the Tomb of Horrors, showing the Copper Key's original location from a reference-packed race for the key. Next on our list of famous D&D dungeons is the Temple of Elemental Evil. This module was designed by Gary Gygax and Frank Misner. Now, while this isn't the best dungeon that was ever created, it definitely has a lot of core aspects for all future dungeons are based on. This was a classic elemental themes comprised the 4 levels of the dungeon. Each level corresponds to an element: earth, wind, air, and fire. Within the dungeon, there's a cute little hamlet as a home base. Another classic aspect of this dungeon was it had curses all along the walls that made you not care about the runes that were on the wall. So you'd walk through it, be affected by the curse, and then you wouldn't look at the future runes on the walls. Now, runes on the walls are definitely a core aspect of all dungeons, but this one took a really unique spin on it, and I've seen it implemented in a lot of other dungeons. Here's another classic aspect that we've even seen in Scooby-Doo. As soon as you sit on this throne, it sinks into the ground. Next on the list is a very interesting module from 1988, Castle Greyhawk. This Advanced Dungeons & Dragons adventure module was written based on the original 13-level dungeon that Gary Gygax wrote up for his players when he was still testing out the original rules for D&D. This idea was created and given to a bunch of writers at TSR. This book and a few others in the Greyhawk line contained the similar style of jokey writing. What the writers at TSR were trying to do was parody their own writing. So you would see a lot of self-referential jokes, silly pop culture memes thrown in there, and weird references. Everything was a joke. I mean, you even fought Thor at one point in the dungeon. Mordenkainen, a character based on Gary Gygax, is trying to make a movie in level 11. Now, this may have been a jab at Gary's attempts to make a D&D movie. So why was this? Each level was a separate adventure written by a different author, containing its own brand of insane and baffling weirdness. Each of the writers were trying to one-up each other, and the unwritten rule was that no joke is so old, no joke is so bad, no shtick is so obvious that it can't be used to trip up the PCs. This theme of writing of DM versus player is generally the type of vibe that I get when I ask old school D&D nerds what playing D&D was like back in the 80s. Last up for the famous D&D dungeons is one of my favorites, Castle Ravenloft. This writing has been taken and redistributed multiple times, and the best part about it is that the writing will be pretty much the same, copied and pasted from the original I6 Castle Ravenloft Advanced D&D module, and replaced in even the writings of Curse of Strahd, the 5th edition adventure module. This is a pure world that is a dungeon in and of itself. What I like best about this module is the entire adventure is basically a huge dungeon. The whole world is an inescapable prison, governed by its warden and cellmate alike, Strahd, the epic vampire and lord of Barovia. Count Strahd von Zarovich was imprisoned after taking revenge on his brother by the Dark Powers, a group that not only is aligned with him, but imprisons him, containing elements such as, at one point, Vecna and Soth, the Dread Knight. Honestly, this dark gothic horror setting has been the inspiration of many of my games, my friends' games, and games that I've personally played in. It's such a rich story, it deserves its own video. If we get enough views on this one, we'll definitely have to make an in-depth Ravenloft video. If I had to sum it up, what makes it so good is the overall story. The story that players find out as they play the game. They learn more as they get more into it. The rich detail of each element in the world. The burgermeisters of each hamlet, the hags, the vampires, the theme of breaking against destiny, fighting the dying of the light. Good versus evil, and love versus loss. This module has everything. And the best part, it was written by a husband and wife duo. How cute can you get? So where do we go from here? The future of D&D dungeons. This is a newer 5th edition module called the Tomb of Annihilation. Its setting is within Chult, inside the Forgotten Realms. There's an island that has a rich tapestry of people, dinosaurs, and a curse. Apparently, there's a death curse going around the island, causing people who are affected to wither slowly over time before dying. Divine magic scholars are at a loss, and no one is able to raise them from the dead. This adventure is designed by Chris Perkins, Will Doyle, Steve Winter, and Adam Lee. Story consulting was done by award-winning creator of Adventure Time, Pendleton Ward. I think that the emphasis away from the goofy puns and the fill-in-the-blank storytelling like Castle Greyhawk, and moving towards adventures like Castle Ravenloft, which, again, I would consider to be one of the best written adventures, like a 10, and then hitting about like an 8.2 on the Tomb of Annihilation, I see the future of D&D dungeons going rather well. In fact, Josh is writing up a fantastic underground floor-by-floor adventure that I can't wait for you guys to listen to. Let's take a break and talk about the effect of D&D dungeons on popular media, as well as the historical dungeon's effect on D&D. How could I forget the most historic of dungeons, the famous dungeon, the Labyrinth. In Greek mythology, a labyrinth is a circular maze with an objective at the center and the escape at one of the points on the edge of the circle. It was originally built to house the Minotaur. The legend goes that the king of Crete, Minos, had a wife who bore a son by means of the white bull sent from Poseidon. The Minotaur was kept in the labyrinth to imprison it and keep the populace in check as a means of punishment. When King Aegeus' son Theus was called to be a tribute to the Minotaur, he vowed to slay the beast with his father's sword. King Minos' daughter fell madly in love with Theseus and gave him a ball of string to help him navigate the maze. He was successful but neglected to put up the white sails to declare his victory to his father. When King Aegeus saw the black sails from his son's boat, he assumed the worst and flung himself into the Aegean Sea, which is named for him to this day. As you can see from this list on Wikipedia or a quick Google search, the impact of labyrinths is incredible. Let's talk about pop culture for labyrinths. The film Labyrinth in 1986 was a musical fantasy film directed by Jim Henson, starring David Bowie, and executive produced by George Lucas. A young girl named Sarah must solve the riddle of the Goblin King's labyrinth in order to prevent the young boy that she was babysitting from becoming a goblin himself. Fun fact, Sarah does find herself trapped in an oubliette. Hey, we brought it all back. Moving on to Pan's Labyrinth, a 2006 Del Toro film, he describes it as a parable influenced by fairy tales. It is about a young girl as well, who must traverse the maze and overcome 3 challenges to fulfill her destiny as princess of the underworld. Getting a little bit more esoteric in our talks about dungeons, the movie Cube featured a group of individuals that find themselves locked in a dungeon with new challenges in each room that they must face in order to progress. Fun fact, this movie was filmed in one room. Another one-room dungeon movie, getting a little bit off topic, but I would still consider this a dungeon, is Saw. 2 very different people must solve challenges and discover the mystery of why they're both locked in the same room as they fight against their captor and each other. Now, we talked about dungeons in video games, inspired by the Tomb of Horrors. We also have a game created in May of 2020, Minecraft Dungeons. This standalone dungeon crawler video game was developed by Mojang Studios. It's a spin-off of Minecraft, and it was released on the Switch, PS4, and Xbox One. It's a top-down, isometrically angled action-adventure video game. I don't play it personally, but I hear it's quite fun. There are tens, if not hundreds, of other dungeon crawlers out there, many inspired by D&D. Not all of them take place only within a dungeon, but others have larger worlds around them, like Lara Croft and the Elder Scrolls series. Within the Elder Scrolls video game series, it features games like Skyrim, which is full of dungeons and high-tier loot inside of them, along with interesting stories from journals of those who have found themselves lost in the caverns. The aesthetic point of dungeons in writing, again, harkens back to the human desire to be free. As a literary device, dungeons find a way to evoke these emotions within us, and as such are fantastic tools to give your players in any tabletop role-playing game. The most important part of this low-tech group storytelling method to use is the location and environment, using descriptive language and world building throughout the dungeons to make the game matter to the players. It's not only about the physical element, but the human element. More so than any average setting, a trapped 4-wall system like a dungeon needs good environment to be engaging. One of the things I liked the most about Castle Ravenloft was the room descriptions. For the most part, even in the Curse of Strahd, the Castle Ravenloft descriptions were simply copied and pasted because of the emotion that they conjure. Here's an example. The ornate, massive doors hang open. Fluttering torches cast dim, yellow flickers of light from the entryway. 20 feet into the castle, a second set of doors suddenly swing open effortlessly, and the sounds of organ music flow out. Overhead in the entryway, 4 statues of dragons glare down, their eyes flickering in the torchlight. Cobwebs hang from dust-covered columns in the Great Hall, illuminated by torches fluttering in iron sconces. The dust and webs cast strange, moving shadows across the faces of the stone gargoyle squatting motionless on the rim of the dome ceiling. Cracked and faded ceiling frescoes are covered by centuries of decay. 2 doors of bronze stand closed to the east. To the north, a wide staircase climbs into the darkness. All the while, sad and majestic organ tones float about you from a lit hallway to the south. Torchlight flutters against the walls of this vaulted hall. To the east, a dark and foreboding hallway runs into the darkness. Beside that opening, a suit of armor, oiled and glistening, stands at attention in the shallow alcove. To the west, large double doors hang slightly open, a steady, bright light escaping through the opening. Swells of organ music now come from behind the doors, spilling the melody of power and defeat into the hall. This is a magnificent 40-foot square room, brilliantly lit by 3 massive crystal chandeliers. Pillars of stone stand against the dull white marble walls supporting the ceiling. In the center of the room, a long, heavy table stands covered in a fine white satin cloth. The table is laden with delectable foods of every type. Roasted beef basted in savory sauce, roots and herbs of every taste, and sweet fruits and vegetables. Places are set for each of you, with a fine, delicate china and silver. At each place there is a crystal goblet filled with an amber liquid, whose delicate fragrance tantalizes your senses. At the center of the far west wall, between floor-to-ceiling length mirrors, stands a massive organ. Its pipes blare out a thunderous melody that offers in its tone greatness and despair. Seated before the keys, its back towards you, a single caped figure pounds the keys in raptured ecstasy. The figure suddenly stops, and a deep silence falls over the dining hall. The figure slowly turns towards you. I hope you all enjoyed this private session at the College of Lore. Please support these videos in any way you can. Sharing them to your friend definitely helps, and so does backing our Patreon. Have a great day, and have a great rest of your weekend.